In 1620, on a plantation built on blood and suffering, a young slave girl named Delphine was murdered for a crime she didn't commit. They buried her in the red Mississippi clay and thought that was the end. They were wrong. Some debts can never be forgiven. Some sins echo through eternity, and some spirits never rest. This is the story of The Reckoning, a 3-part horror tale of vengeance from beyond the grave. Before we begin, if you enjoy dark historical horror and tales of supernatural justice, don't forget to subscribe and hit that notification bell. And drop a comment below telling us where you're watching from. We love hearing from our viewers around the world. Now, let's descend into the darkness. The Mississippi earth was red as blood when they buried Delphine. Thomas Whitmore stood at the edge of the shallow grave, his boots caked with the same crimson clay that would soon cover the girl's broken body. He didn't remove his hat, didn't bow his head. The October sun beat down on the small gathering 3 other slaves who'd been ordered to dig, his overseer, Jacob Brennan, and his wife Margaret, who watched from the covered porch of the plantation house, her handkerchief pressed to her nose as though the smell of death might reach her even from that distance. "Cover her," Thomas said, his voice flat as the cotton fields stretching beyond the tree line. The slaves, Moses, an older man with graying hair, Ruth, a woman of middle years, and Samuel, barely more than a boy, began pushing the dirt over Delphine's body. None of them looked at their master. None of them spoke. But Thomas saw the way Ruth's hands trembled, the way Moses's jaw clenched so tight the muscle jumped beneath his dark skin. "You think I'm cruel?" Thomas said, more to himself than to them. "But she stole from me. Silver candlesticks from my own table. What was I to do? Let thievery go unpunished?" No one answered. The only sound was the whisper of dirt sliding. Over cloth, over flesh, over the face that had screamed for mercy just hours before. Thomas hadn't meant to kill her. That's what he would tell himself in the days to come. He'd meant only to teach her a lesson, to make an example. But when the whip came down for the 23rd time, or was it the 24th? Delphine had stopped screaming, stopped moving, and when Jacob checked her pulse, there was nothing but silence. "She was weak," Jacob said now, as if reading Thomas's thoughts. The overseer was a thick man with hands like slabs of meat and a face perpetually reddened by the sun and drink. "Some of them just can't take a proper correction." Thomas nodded, but something cold had settled in his chest. It wasn't guilt, he refused to call it that. He'd done what any master would do, what he had every right to do. The girl was his property, and property didn't have the luxury of mercy. "Master Whitmore," Samuel said, so quietly Thomas almost didn't hear. "Master Whitmore." "She didn't steal nothing." Thomas turned slowly. The boy had stopped shoveling and stood frozen, his eyes wide with the kind of fear that came from speaking out of turn. "What did you say?" Samuel's mouth opened and closed. Ruth grabbed his arm, her nails digging into his flesh. But it was too late. "The candlesticks," Samuel whispered. "Mistress Margaret, she moved them to the dining room. I seen her. Delphine didn't take nothing." The silence that followed was profound. Even the cicadas seemed to pause in their droning song. Thomas felt the blood rushing in his ears, felt the world tilt just slightly off its axis. "You're lying," he said. But even as the words left his mouth, he remembered Margaret's strange mood that morning. The way she'd avoided his eyes at breakfast. The way she'd retired to her room and refused to come out, even as Delphine's screams echoed across the property. "Finish burying her," Thomas said. turning on his heel. Now, he strode back toward the house, his hands balling into fists. Behind him, he heard the renewed sound of shoveling. Faster now. Urgent. He didn't look back. Didn't want to see what he'd done, what he couldn't undo. Margaret was still on the porch when he reached the house. She'd gone pale beneath her powder, her handkerchief twisted between her fingers. "Thomas, don't," he said, pushing past her into the cool darkness of the house. "Don't say a word." But that night, lying in bed with Margaret's silent form beside him, Thomas couldn't escape the image of Delphine's face, the way her eyes had looked up at him in those final moments. Not with hate, as he might have expected, but with something worse, a kind of knowing, a promise. He rose just after midnight, unable to sleep. The house was quiet, save for the ticking of the grandfather clock in the hall and the soft whisper of wind through the eaves. He poured himself whiskey in the study. Then another, trying to drown the unease that had settled over him like a shroud. That's when he heard it, a sound from outside. Not the normal sounds of night, the owls and crickets and distant howl of a dog. This was different. A rhythmic scraping, like metal on stone, or like hands clawing through earth. Thomas went to the window, pulled back the curtain. The moon was full and bright, casting the grounds in silver light. He could see the tree line where they'd buried Delphine, could see the mound of fresh-turned earth, could see the mound moving. He blinked, certain it was the whiskey, certain it was his imagination. But no, the earth was shifting, heaving upward as though something beneath was pushing its way out. "Christ," he breathed, stumbling back from the window. It had to be an animal, a wild pig, perhaps, rooting at the grave. But even as he told himself this, he knew it wasn't true. He knew because he could feel it now, a presence that seemed to press against the very walls of the house, cold and patient and absolutely certain. Thomas grabbed his rifle from above the mantel and made his way to the back door. His hands were shaking from the whiskey, he told himself, only the whiskey as he stepped out into the night. The air had changed. It tasted of copper and rot, and somewhere in the distance, he heard a sound that might have been laughter or might have been screaming. He moved across the yard, his rifle raised, his heart hammering against his ribs. The grave was still 100 yards away when he saw her. She stood at the edge of the tree line, her burial shroud hanging in tatters from her frame. The moonlight caught her face, that beautiful face he'd destroyed with his whip, and Thomas saw that the wounds were still there. The flesh hung in strips from her cheeks and forehead, revealing the white gleam of bone beneath. Her neck bent at an unnatural angle, broken from where Jakob had dragged her body across the yard. But her eyes, God help him, her eyes were alive. "Delphine," he whispered, and the rifle nearly fell from his nerveless fingers. She smiled. At least her ruined mouth attempted the expression, pulling back to reveal teeth stained with grave dirt. Then she took a step toward him. Thomas fired. The shot echoed across the fields, loud enough to wake the dead. And perhaps it had, perhaps that's what this was. The bullet caught Delphine in the chest, punching through the thin fabric of her shroud. She staggered back a step. Then she kept walking. "No," Thomas said. "No, this isn't, you're dead. I buried you. You're dead." He fired again, and again, each shot finding its mark, each shot doing nothing to stop her slow, inexorable advance. The rifle clicked empty, and Thomas threw it aside, turning to run back to the house. He'd made it halfway across the yard when she caught him. Her hand cold as the grave she'd crawled from closed around his ankle, and Thomas fell hard, the air rushing from his lungs. He twisted onto his back, saw her, looming over him, her shadow blotting out the moon. "Please," he gasped. "Please, I'm sorry, I didn't mean," she repeated, and her voice was like wind through a tomb, hollow and ancient. "Didn't mean to break my back with your whip? Didn't mean to work me until my hands bled? Didn't mean to kill me for a crime I didn't commit? I'll make it right," Thomas sobbed. All dignity fled. "I'll free them all, Moses and Ruth and Samuel. You'll die," Delphine said simply. Her hands, those same hands that had scrubbed his floors and cooked his meals and picked his cotton closed around his throat. Thomas thrashed, his fingers clawing at her wrists, but she was impossibly strong. The world began to darken at the edges, his lungs screaming for air that wouldn't come. And then, suddenly, she released him. Thomas gasped, rolling onto his side, retching and coughing. When he looked up, Delphine was standing over him still, her head tilted at that horrible broken angle. "Not yet," she said. "Death would be mercy. And you showed me none." Then she turned and walked back toward the tree line, her form dissolving into shadow, leaving Thomas alone in the yard with his terror and his guilt. He scrambled to his feet and ran for the house, slamming and bolting the door behind him. Margaret was on the stairs in her nightgown, her face pale and frightened. "Thomas? What's happening? I heard shots. Get back to your room," he snarled. "Lock the door. Don't come out until morning. But now!" She fled, and Thomas sagged against the door, his whole body trembling. It wasn't possible. It couldn't be possible. The dead didn't walk. The dead didn't rise up for vengeance. But he'd seen her, touched her, felt the cold certainty of those dead hands around his throat. He spent the rest of the night in his study, every lamp lit, the new rifle across his lap. He dozed fitfully as dawn broke, and when the first light of day crept through the place's windows, he almost wept with relief. Surely it had been a nightmare, a whiskey-soaked delusion brought on by guilt and exhaustion. But when Jacob came to the house mid-morning, the overseer's face was ashen. "Master Whitmore," he said, "you need to come see something." Thomas followed him outside, dread coiling in his belly. They walked across the yard, past the spot where Thomas had fallen, where he could still see the imprint of his body in the dew-damp grass. They walked to the tree line, to the grave. It was empty. The earth had been torn apart from within, great clods of red clay thrown aside. The burial shroud lay in tatters at the bottom of the shallow hole, and there, pressed into the mud at the grave's edge, was a single handprint. "The slaves," Jacob said, his voice tight. "They're saying she's come back, that she'll have her vengeance on all of us." Thomas stared at the empty grave and felt the last of his certainty crumble away. "Lock down the property," he said. "No one leaves. No one comes in. And tonight," he swallowed hard, "tonight we keep watch," because he knew, with the cold certainty of a man who'd looked into his own grave, that Delphine would return, and next time she wouldn't show mercy. She'd shown him that much already. As the sun climbed higher, Thomas sent Jacob to gather the slaves. He needed answers, needed to know if they'd seen anything, if they knew anything. But when the overseer returned, his face was even paler than before. "They're gone," Jacob said. "Moses, Ruth, Samuel, all of them. The quarters are empty. Thomas felt a chill despite the growing heat. They ran? Or were taken, Jakob said quietly, his eyes darting to the tree line. There's blood at Moses's door. Not much, but... He didn't finish the thought. Thomas armed himself with a pistol and knife and went to investigate. The slave quarters were a row of shabby cabins at the eastern edge of the property, far enough from the main house that their inhabitants could be forgotten until they were needed. Now, walking among the silent structures, Thomas felt the wrongness of the place settle over him like a pall. Jakob was right. There was blood at Moses's door, a single handprint, small and delicate, a woman's hand. The door hung open, revealing an interior that looked as though a storm had passed through it. The simple furniture was overturned, the sleeping pallet torn apart, and more blood spattered the walls in patterns Thomas didn't want to examine too closely. "Moses!" he called out. His voice echoed back to him, mocking. "Ruth! Samuel!" Nothing. They checked the other cabins, all empty, all showing signs of struggle or hasty flight. At Ruth's cabin, they found her head wrap on the floor, stained with something dark. At Samuel's, the door had been torn completely off its hinges, the wood splintered as though by immense force. "We should leave," Jakob said. "Pack what we can carry and ride for Natchez. Tell the authorities." "Tell them what?" Thomas snapped. "That a dead slave girl rose from her grave? They'd hang us both for madness. Then what do we do?" Thomas looked back toward the main house, where Margaret waited, where his life, his property, his entire world resided. He'd built this place with his own hands and his father's money. He wouldn't abandon it to superstition and fear. "We wait," he said, "and when she comes back, we send her back to hell where she belongs." But even as he said it, Thomas remembered the feel of those dead hands around his throat, remembered the hollow certainty in Delphine's voice. Asterisk, "You'll die." Asterisk, "Not yet," she'd said, because death would be mercy. And Thomas Whitmore was beginning to understand that mercy was one thing he'd never receive. The afternoon passed with agonizing slowness. Thomas and Jakob secured the house as best they could, nailing shutters over windows, barring doors, loading every rifle and pistol they owned. Margaret stayed in her room, refusing to come out even for meals. Thomas could hear her pacing, praying, weeping. He felt nothing for her. Not anymore. She'd set this in motion with her carelessness, her misplaced candlesticks. She'd let him kill an innocent girl and said nothing. As evening fell, Thomas posted himself in the main hall with a clear view of both entrances. Jakob took the second floor. They'd agreed to stay awake, to keep watch, to be ready. The sun set. Darkness came. And with it, the waiting. Thomas's eyes grew heavy despite his fear. The events of the previous night and the sleepless hours since weighed on him. He shook himself, poured more whiskey, enough to stay sharp, but not enough to dull his senses. That's when he heard it. A voice, distant and faint, singing. "Wade in the water, wade in the water, children." Thomas's blood went cold. He knew that song. The slaves sang it sometimes in the fields, when they thought no one could hear. A mournful tune about deliverance and freedom. "God's gonna trouble the water." The voice was coming from outside, from the direction of the slave quarters. Thomas moved to the window, peered through a gap in the shutters. She was there, standing in the middle of the yard, her broken form silhouetted against the rising moon. And around her, emerging from the darkness like ghosts, came the others. Moses, his chest torn open, ribs gleaming white. Ruth, her throat slashed ear to ear, head lolling forward. Samuel, his small body twisted and broken. And dozens more figures Thomas didn't recognize, slaves who must have died here before he'd inherited the property, rising now from wherever they'd been, forgotten. An army of the dead, and Delphine at their head. "Jakob!" Thomas screamed. "Jakob! They're here!" The overseer thundered down the stairs, saw what Thomas saw, and went white. "Sweet Christ," he whispered. The dead began to move toward the house. Not rushing, not urgent. They had all the time in the world. Thomas grabbed his rifle, aimed at Delphine through the window. But even as he prepared to fire, he saw her smile, that terrible, ruined smile. "Shooting me didn't work last night," she called out, her voice carrying clearly across the yard. "What makes you think it will work now?" Thomas fired anyway. The bullet punched through her shoulder, spinning her halfway around. She laughed, actually laughed, and kept walking. "The doors!" Jakob yelled. "They're at the doors!" The dead had split up, some heading for the front entrance, others for the back. Thomas heard wood creak and groan as they pressed against the barriers. Heard Margaret screaming from upstairs. "We have to fight!" Thomas shouted. But even as he said it, he knew it was hopeless. How did you fight the dead? How did you kill what had already died? The back door exploded inward, torn from its frame. Moses came through first, his ruined chest cavity a black hollow in the lamplight. Jakob fired point blank into his head. And Moses staggered, but didn't fall. Instead, he reached out with hands strong as iron and grabbed Jakob by the throat, lifting him clear off his feet. "Master Jakob," Moses said, and his voice bubbled with the blood still pooling in his chest cavity. "You remember me? Remember the day you took my wife? Sold her down the river? Told me if I complained, you'd do the same to my children?" Jakob's answer was lost in the crunch of vertebrae separating. Thomas ran. There was no shame in it, no thought beyond pure animal survival. He bolted for the stairs, taking them 3 at a time, heading for Margaret's room. If he could get her, if they could barricade themselves, maybe they could last until dawn. Ruth stepped out of the shadows at the top of the stairs. Thomas tried to stop, tried to reverse his momentum, but he was moving too fast. Ruth simply extended one hand and pushed. Thomas tumbled backward down the stairs, his body striking wood and railing, bones snapping, with sounds like dry branches. He landed at the bottom in a twisted heap, the breath knocked from his lungs, agony shooting through his left leg where the bone had punched through skin. Delphine was standing over him when his vision cleared. "Now," she said softly, "now we begin." She knelt beside him, and Thomas saw that the others had gathered around as well. The dead, filling his house, surrounding him with their cold presence and their patient hatred. "Please," he whispered, "please, just end it." "Oh, Thomas," Delphine said, and for a moment her ruined face looked almost sad. "We're only getting started." She reached down and placed one cold hand on his broken leg, squeezed. Thomas screamed. And somewhere in the darkness, someone began to sing again. "Wade in the water. Wade in the water, children. God's gonna trouble the water." Thomas Whitmore learned that night that there are worse things than death. His broken body lay at the foot of the stairs, while Delphine and her dead congregation stood witness. Every breath was agony, ribs grinding against punctured lung, the compound fracture of his leg sending white-hot spikes of pain through his consciousness. He wished for unconsciousness, for the black mercy of oblivion, but Delphine wouldn't allow it. Each time his eyes began to flutter closed, she'd press her cold fingers to his temples, and he'd jerk awake with a gasp, his heart racing with a terror that never dimmed. "No sleeping," she whispered. "Not yet. You need to be awake for this. Need to understand what's coming." Moses dragged Jacob's corpse into the hall, arranging it where Thomas could see. The overseer's face was purple, his neck bent at an obscene angle, his eyes bulging. Thomas had known Jacob for 15 years, had shared drinks with him, had laughed at his crude jokes. Now he was just meat, just another piece of evidence of what Thomas had built here. "Margaret," Thomas croaked. "Where's—" "Upstairs," Ruth said, moving to stand where he could see her. The wound across her throat gaped like a second mouth when she spoke, but her voice was clear enough. "Don't worry, Master Whitmore. We haven't forgotten about Mistress Margaret." As if summoned by her name, Thomas heard his wife scream from above. Not the sharp cry of sudden fright, but the long, drawn-out wail of someone who'd been confronted with something too horrible to comprehend. "What are you doing to her?" Thomas tried to rise, managed only to shift his broken body a few inches before the pain drove him back down. "The same thing she did to us," Delphine said. She moved to sit on the stairs above him, her burial shroud arranging itself around her like a mockery of the fine dresses she'd never been allowed to wear. "Do you know what your wife did, Thomas?" "Your good Christian wife?" Thomas said nothing. Couldn't have spoken if he'd wanted to, his throat closing with fear. "She helped Jacob," Ruth said, "when he came to my cabin that night. When he took what wasn't his to take. I screamed for help, and she heard me. I know she did, because I saw her lamp go out, saw her pull the curtains closed. And the next morning, when I couldn't work because of what he'd done to me, she's the one who suggested you dock my rations. Said I was being lazy. That's not," Thomas started. "True?" Delphine finished. "You don't know what's true, Thomas. You never did. You lived in this house like a king in a castle, and you never once looked at what was happening in the shadows around you." Young Samuel emerged from the kitchen, his small body moving with the jerky, unnatural gait of a puppet with tangled strings. He carried a bundle in his arms, something wrapped in old cloth. "Master Whitmore," Samuel said, kneeling beside Thomas, "I want to show you something." He unwrapped the bundle with care, revealing a collection of small objects: a wooden horse, badly carved, a rag doll with button eyes, a smooth river stone, a child's treasures. "My sister's," Samuel explained. "She was 6 when she died. You remember her?" "Probably not. Just another slave child. Another piece of property that stopped being useful." Thomas did remember, vaguely, a small girl who'd caught fever and died in the space of a week. He'd paid for her burial, a decent Christian burial, he'd thought, more than he had to do. "She didn't die of fever," Samuel said softly. "She died because Mistress Margaret wouldn't call the doctor. Said it wasn't worth the expense for a slave child. So my sister burned up from the inside while I held her hand and begged God to save her." Samuel carefully rewrapped the objects, his movements gentle, despite his broken body. When he looked up at Thomas, his young eyes were ancient with pain. "I was going to run away," Samuel said. "Was saving up, hiding bits of food, planning to head north. Delphine was going to help me, and then you killed her for something she didn't do." He stood, tucking the bundle under his arm. "So now we're all together again, one big family." More figures emerged from the darkness of the house, from rooms Thomas had never allowed them to enter in life, spaces they claimed now in death. He recognized some of them. The field hand who'd died when a plow horse kicked him in the head, the woman who'd bled out giving birth to a child Thomas had already sold downriver, the old man who'd simply worked until his heart gave out. But there were others, too. Slaves from before his time, from when his father had run the plantation. Some of the bodies were little more than bones and scraps of clothing held together by will and rage. How many? Thomas whispered. How many did we? 47, Delphine said. That we know of. 47 souls buried in unmarked graves, forgotten as soon as they stopped being useful. Some died from overwork, some from punishment, some from simple neglect. She leaned closer. And some from cruelty. Margaret's screaming had stopped, replaced by hysterical sobbing. Thomas heard footsteps on the floor above, multiple sets, moving back and forth. What are they doing to her? He asked again. Showing her, Ruth said. Showing her all of it. Every moment we suffered while she looked away. Every time she heard us cry and did nothing. Every time she smiled at guests and served them tea while we bled in the fields. The night stretched on. Thomas faded in and out of lucidity, the pain and shock taking their toll. But each time his mind began to slip away, Delphine would touch him, would pull him back to consciousness with her cold fingers and colder resolve. She told him stories about her life before the plantation, when she'd been free, about her mother, who'd been caught by slavers and sold south, about the dreams she'd had of escape, of freedom, of a life that was hers to live. I was going to leave, she said. I'd saved enough, made a plan. Samuel was going to come with me. We were going to run all in Excessin, the way to Canada, if we had to. Her broken face twisted into something that might have been a smile. And then your wife moved those candlesticks, and you killed me for it. I'm sorry, Thomas whispered for the 100th time. I'm sorry, please. I didn't know. You didn't want to know, Delphine corrected. There's a difference, Thomas. You could have asked questions, could have waited, could have shown even the smallest mercy. But you didn't, because we weren't people to you. We were property, things, and you can do whatever you want to things. Dawn was still hours away when they finally brought Margaret down. She descended the stairs like a sleepwalker, her nightgown torn and bloody, her face blank with shock. The dead parted to let her pass, and she sank to her knees beside Thomas without seeming to see him. Margaret, Thomas said. Margaret, look at me. She turned slowly, and Thomas saw that her eyes were empty. Everything that had made her Margaret Whitmore scoured, away by whatever she'd experienced upstairs. They showed me, she whispered. Showed me everything. Every face, every name, every moment of suffering. They made me feel it, Thomas. Made me live it. That's not possible, Thomas said. But even as he spoke, he knew it was a lie. Everything that was happening was impossible, yet it was happening anyway. Delphine knelt beside them both, her form casting a shadow that seemed to swallow the lamplight. Here's what's going to happen, she said, her voice carrying the weight of absolute certainty. You're going to live, Thomas, both of you. We're not going to kill you, not quickly anyway. You're going to stay here in this house, and you're going to remember. Every day, you'll remember what you did, what you are. And when you finally die, and you will, eventually, you'll join us. You'll know what it is to be trapped to be owned, to be nothing more than property. "Please," Margaret whimpered, "please, just let us go." "Where would you go?" Ruth asked. "Who would take you in, broken as you are? Who would believe you? No one. You'll die here, in this house you built on our bones." The dead began to fade as dawn approached, dissolving into shadow and memory. But Delphine remained until the very end, her form becoming translucent as the first rays of sun crept through the shattered doorway. "One more thing," she said, touching Thomas's forehead with one cold finger. "So you'll never forget." The pain that lanced through his skull was worse than anything he'd felt all night. Thomas screamed, his body arching, and then suddenly he was seeing through Delphine's eyes, feeling what she'd felt, the sting of the whip across his back, the burn of rope around his wrists. The crushing exhaustion of working until his body gave out, then being forced to work more. The hunger, the thirst, the casual cruelty. And finally, the last moments of Delphine's life, staring up at Thomas's face as the whip came down again and again, begging for mercy that never came, feeling his body break and his heart slow and his last breath rattle out. And through it all, the knowledge that this was happening for something he didn't do, that he was dying innocent, that no one would ever know or care. When Thomas came back to himself, he was sobbing uncontrollably, his hands clawing at his face as though he could tear away the memory. "Now you know," Delphine said. She was almost gone now, just a whisper of shadow in the growing light. "Now you understand. And you'll carry that understanding until the day you die." Then she was gone, and Thomas and Margaret were alone in the wreckage of their house and their lives. The days that followed became a waking nightmare. Thomas's legs set badly, leaving him with a permanent limp. His ribs healed slowly, each breath a reminder of that terrible night. But the physical pain was nothing compared to the other wounds Delphine had inflicted. The memories she'd given him her. Memories played through his mind constantly. He'd be eating breakfast, and suddenly he'd remember the taste of the slop the slaves had been fed, the moldy cornmeal and rancid fat. He'd look at his hands and see them covered in scars from the cotton bolls, from the work that never ended. He'd close his eyes and feel the whip, again and again, until he couldn't tell where Delphine's memories ended and his own pain began. Margaret was worse. She'd retreated somewhere inside herself, becoming a hollow shell that moved through the house like a ghost. She didn't eat unless Thomas forced her, didn't sleep except when exhaustion claimed her. And when she did sleep, she screamed. They couldn't leave the property. Thomas tried once, managed to hitch his carriage and drive to the edge of his land before the horses spooked and bolted. He'd looked ahead and seen why the road was lined with the dead, standing silent, waiting. They didn't attack, didn't move. They simply stood there, a wall of corpses blocking any escape. Thomas turned back, and he never tried to leave again. The house itself seemed to decay around them, wood that had been sound rotted overnight. The well water turned brackish and foul. Crops in the field withered on the vine. It was as though the land itself had turned against them, rejecting the men who'd watered it with blood and tears. At night, they came. The dead didn't harm Thomas or Margaret, not physically. But they were there, walking through the halls, standing at the foot of the bed, watching with their empty eyes. Sometimes Thomas would wake to find Samuel sitting beside him, playing with his sister's toys. Sometimes Ruth would be in the kitchen, moving through the motions of preparing food that would never be eaten. Sometimes Moses stood in the doorway, his ruined chest laid bare, accusing without words. And Delphine. Always Delphine. She never spoke after that first night, but she was there, a constant presence, making sure they remembered, making sure they could never forget. Thomas began talking to himself, having conversations with people who weren't there. He'd argue with his father's ghost, insisting that he'd only done what he'd been taught. He'd plead with God, asking why he was being punished when so many others had done worse. He'd beg Delphine for forgiveness, promising to change, to be better, to make amends. The dead never answered. They just watched. Margaret found her voice again 3 weeks after that terrible night. Thomas woke to find her standing at the window, staring out at the slave quarters. "We should burn it," she said. "Burn the whole plantation. Burn it to the ground." "And then what?" Thomas asked. "Where would we go?" "Anywhere," Margaret said. She turned to look at him, and for the first time in weeks, there was something like clarity in her eyes. Anywhere but here. But Thomas knew better. There was no anywhere for them. The plantation was their prison, and the dead were their jailers. They would live out their days here, surrounded by the evidence of their sins, until finally death claimed them. And after death, Thomas didn't want to think about after death. On the anniversary of Delphine's murder, exactly 1 year to the day, Thomas and Margaret woke to find the house transformed. Every wall was covered in writing names, dates, stories, the names of everyone who died on the plantation, the dates of their deaths, and brief, heartbreaking summaries of their lives. Sarah, age 22, died in childbirth. Baby sold before birth. Marcus, aged 45, worked to death in the fields. Wife and children sold separately. Esther, aged 8, died of fever. Medical care denied. Jacob, aged 19, beaten to death for learning to read. On and on and on, covering every surface, written in what looked like dried blood. Thomas tried to wash it away, scrubbing until his hands bled, but the words remained. They'd been etched into the very bones of the house. That night. Delphine spoke to them for the second time. She appeared in the parlor where Thomas and Margaret huddled together, their minds fracturing under the weight of constant terror. She looked different, now less corpse-like, more solid, as though the year of haunting had given her strength. "You're wondering when it will end," she said. It wasn't a question. Thomas nodded, unable to find his voice. "It won't," Delphine said simply. "Not in your lifetime. You'll grow old here, Thomas Whitmore. You'll watch your body fail, your mind crumble. And when you finally die, when you think you've finally escaped," she smiled that terrible smile, "that's when your real punishment begins." "What do you want from us?" Margaret sobbed. "What can we do?" "Nothing," Delphine said. "There's nothing you can do. No atonement, no redemption. You can't undo what you've done. You can't bring back the dead or heal the suffering. All you can do is live with it, feel it, carry it until it breaks." She moved closer, and Thomas saw that behind her, the others were gathering, the dead filling the room, pressing close, their presence suffocating. "You wanted to own people," Delphine said, "to treat them as property, as less than human. So now you'll know what it feels like. Every moment of every day, you belong to us. Your lives are ours. Your suffering is ours. You're our property now, Thomas. You and Margaret both. We'll tell people," Thomas said desperately. "We'll confess. We'll—" "Who would believe you?" Ruth asked. "Who would care? You think anyone will mourn a slaver who got what he deserved?" She was right. Thomas knew she was right. Even if they somehow escaped, even if they told their story, they'd be dismissed as mad, and the dead would follow them wherever they went, a shadow that could never be outrun. "1 year," Delphine said. "You've survived 1 year. How many more do you think you have in you? How many more years of this before your hearts give out, or your minds shatter completely?" Thomas had no answer. He simply bowed his head and wept, while Margaret rocked back and forth beside him, humming a tuneless melody that might have been a prayer or might have been the first notes of madness. The dead remained throughout the night, a silent congregation bearing witness, and when dawn came and they faded away, Thomas and Margaret were left alone in their prison of wood and guilt and memory. The house on the red clay hill became a legend over time. Travelers passing by reported seeing lights in the windows, hearing music and voices. Some claimed to see figures moving through the abandoned rooms, a man and woman, elderly and broken, wandering endlessly through halls covered in names. And sometimes, on clear nights when the moon was full, those same travelers reported seeing a young woman standing at the edge of the property, a beautiful woman in a tattered burial shroud, watching over her domain with patient, eternal eyes, making, too sure that Thomas and Margaret Whitmore never forgot, making sure they never would. 23 years after Delphine rose from her grave, a young man named Daniel Whitmore arrived at the plantation. He was Thomas's nephew, son of Thomas's younger brother William, who'd made his fortune in shipping up north and had carefully avoided ever visiting the family estate in Mississippi. Daniel had heard stories, of course whispered tales of his uncle's madness, of the haunted plantation where Thomas and Margaret lived in isolation. Refusing all visitors, all help, Daniel was 22, educated at Yale, and possessed of the absolute certainty of youth that he could fix what others could not. He'd come to Mississippi with plans to restore the plantation, to help his uncle, to perhaps claim his inheritance if the old man proved too far gone. He arrived on an October afternoon, the same month Delphine had died, and found the property in a state of advanced decay. The fields were overgrown with weeds. The slave quarters had collapsed into rotting timber, and the main house looked like something from a Gothic nightmare paint peeling, shutters hanging askew, the whole structure seeming to lean slightly as though weary of standing. Daniel hitched his horse and approached the front door. It hung open, creaking in the breeze. He called out, but received no answer. Steeling himself, he entered. The interior was worse than the exterior. Everything was covered in dust and filth, as though no one had cleaned in years. Furniture lay broken and scattered, and covering every wall, written in what Daniel prayed was paint but feared was something else, were names and dates and stories. "Uncle Thomas?" Daniel called out, his voice echoing through the empty halls. "Aunt Margaret?" A sound from upstairs, shuffling footsteps, slow and unsteady. Daniel climbed the stairs carefully, noting the places where the wood had rotted through, where one misstep might send him crashing down. He found Thomas in what had once been the master bedroom. The old man was barely recognizable. Thomas Whitmore had been a vigorous 50 when Daniel last saw his portrait. Now he looked ancient, withered, his hair white and wild, his body bent and broken. He sat in a chair by the window, staring out at nothing, and didn't turn when Daniel entered. "Uncle Thomas?" "It's Daniel, William's son." Thomas's head turned slowly. His eyes were rheumy and distant, but there was something in them, a flicker of recognition, and beneath that, something that might have been fear or might have been relief. "Daniel," Thomas whispered, his voice like wind through dead leaves. "You shouldn't have come." "I'm here to help," Daniel said, moving closer. "Father sent me. We're worried about you, about Aunt Margaret. Where is she?" "Gone," Thomas said. 3 months now. Her heart or her mind. Same thing in the end." Daniel felt a pang of sorrow. He'd barely known Margaret, but still. "I'm sorry. But you don't have to stay here alone. Come back north with me. We'll find you proper care, somewhere comfortable." "Can't leave," Thomas interrupted. "Not allowed." "Uncle, no one's keeping you prisoner. You're free to—" "Not free," Thomas said, and he laughed a horrible, broken sound. "Never free. Not anymore. We're hers now. Always will be." Daniel frowned. His father had warned him that Thomas might be mad, but he'd hoped it was exaggeration. Whose? "Uncle, what are you talking about?" Thomas turned back to the window. "Delphine's. And the others. All of them. They won't let us leave. Won't let us die. We have to stay. Have to remember." A chill ran down Daniel's spine, despite the warm afternoon. "Uncle Thomas, there's no one here. The slaves are long gone. The plantation is abandoned." "They're here," Thomas insisted. "Always here. You'll see. Tonight, when it gets dark, you'll see." Daniel tried to reason with him, tried to coax him downstairs, but Thomas refused to move. Eventually, Daniel gave up and went to explore the rest of the house, hoping to find something that might explain his uncle's condition. He found Margaret's body in the cellar. She'd been there for months, based on the state of decay, simply lying on the dirt floor as though she'd laid down to rest and never risen. Daniel stumbled back, horrified, and wondered how Thomas had survived alone with his dead wife rotting beneath the house. Daniel fled the cellar and went outside, gasping in fresh air, trying to steady his nerves. He needed to leave, needed to get Thomas out of here and contact the authorities about Margaret. But it was already late afternoon, and he knew he couldn't travel safely in the dark. He'd have to stay the night. The thought filled him with inexplicable dread. As the sun began to set, Daniel built a fire in the parlor and tried to make the space habitable. He'd brought supplies, food, blankets, lamp oil, and he used them to create a small island of normalcy in the midst of decay. Thomas eventually came downstairs, drawn by the smell of food, and ate mechanically, without seeming to taste anything. "Tell me what happened here," Daniel said gently. "Tell me about Delphine." Thomas's hands began to shake. He set down his fork and stared into the fire. "I killed her," he said. "Killed an innocent girl for a crime she didn't commit, and she came back and showed me." He closed his eyes. "Showed me what I really was. That was 23 years ago, Uncle. Whatever happened? It's still happening," Thomas said. "Every day, every night, they're always here, always watching. Making sure I remember, making sure I suffer. There's no one here but us," Daniel said firmly. But even as he spoke, he felt the temperature in the room drop, felt something shift in the air around them. Thomas looked at him with eyes that had seen too much. "Wait," was all he said. As darkness fell completely, Daniel began to understand. It started with sounds, footsteps in the rooms above, though no one was there, the creak of floorboards under invisible weight, whispers in a language Daniel couldn't quite make out, like voices heard through water. Then the temperature dropped further, until Daniel could see his breath misting in the air despite the fire. The flames themselves seemed to dim, as though something was stealing the light. "They're coming," Thomas whispered. "They always come. And then Daniel saw her. Delphine materialized at the edge of the firelight, her form translucent but becoming more solid with each passing moment. She was young and beautiful, despite the terrible wounds that marked her flesh, despite the unnatural angle of her broken neck. She looked at Daniel with eyes that held depths of pain and rage he couldn't fathom. "Who are you?" she asked, her voice echoing strangely in the room. Daniel tried to speak, but found his voice had abandoned him. Terror like he'd never known gripped his heart. "Daniel," Thomas said tiredly. "My nephew. He came to take me away." "Did he?" Delphine glided closer, studying Daniel with unsettling intensity. "And where would you take him?" "Daniel Whitmore. Somewhere safe? Somewhere he can forget?" Daniel swallowed hard. "I just wanted to help." "Help," Delphine repeated. She turned to look at Thomas. "Do you hear that, Thomas? He wants to help you. How generous, how kind." Her voice dripped with bitter irony. Other figures began to appear around the room. Moses with his ruined chest, Ruth with her slashed throat, Samuel's small, broken form, and dozens more, emerging from shadow, filling the space until Daniel felt suffocated by their presence. "You're not real," Daniel said, though his voice shook. "Your grief, or madness, or we're dead," Ruth said flatly. "But we're real enough. Real as the suffering we endured. Real as the blood that watered this land." Samuel moved closer to Daniel, his young face solemn. "Do you know what this place is built on?" the boy asked. "Do you know how many of us died to make the Whitmore family rich?" Daniel shook his head mutely. 47, Delphine said. "That we've found. But there were more, scattered across other plantations your family owned. Generations of suffering, also men like your uncle could live in comfort." "I didn't," Daniel started. "I never owned slaves?" Moses finished. "Never benefited from slavery? Look at your fine clothes, boy. Your education, the money that brought you here. Where do you think that came from?" Daniel wanted to argue, wanted to defend himself, but the words died in his throat because they were right. His father's fortune, his own comfortable life, all of it traced back to places like this, to people like Thomas, to the system that had treated human beings as property. "I'm not like him," Daniel said, gesturing to Thomas. "I believe slavery is wrong, but you benefit from it all the same," Delphine said. "You eat the fruit of a poisoned tree and tell yourself you're innocent because you didn't plant it." She moved closer until Daniel could feel the cold radiating from her form. "Tell me, Daniel Whitmore, what have you done to make amends? What have you sacrificed? What have you given up?" Daniel had no answer. "That's what I thought," Delphine said. She turned away, dismissing him. "You can leave whenever you want. You're not bound here like your uncle. You're free to go back to your comfortable life and forget all about this place." "What about Uncle Thomas?" "He stays," Delphine said. "He stays until he dies, and then he stays longer still. That was the bargain. That was the price." Daniel looked at his uncle, saw the acceptance in the old man's eyes, and felt a surge of helpless anger. "This isn't justice," he said. "This is revenge. This is cruelty." "Yes," Delphine agreed. "It is. How does it feel?" The dead remained through the night, a silent presence that never quite went away, even when they faded from sight. Daniel tried to sleep, but couldn't, his mind racing with everything he'd seen, everything he'd learned. As dawn broke, Delphine appeared one final time. "You'll leave now," she said. It wasn't a question. Daniel looked at Thomas, who sat slumped in his chair, exhausted and hollow-eyed. "I can't just abandon him," Daniel said. "You will," Delphine said with certainty, "because you're not strong enough to stay. Because the weight of this place would crush you. You'll go back north, and you'll tell yourself you did what you could, and you'll move on with your life." She paused. "And maybe that's for the best. Maybe one person's suffering is enough." "What about forgiveness?" Daniel asked desperately. "What about mercy?" "I begged for mercy," Delphine said quietly. "On the day he killed me, I begged and screamed and pleaded. Do you know what your uncle did?" He laughed. He said I needed to be taught a lesson. She looked at Prive, Thomas with eyes that held no pity. "So that's what I'm doing, teaching him a lesson, one that lasts forever." Daniel left that morning, promising Thomas he'd return, knowing he wouldn't. Delphine was right. He wasn't strong enough to bear this place, this history, this weight of sin and suffering. As he rode away, he looked back once and saw them standing in front of the house. Thomas, small and broken, and behind him the gathered dead, watching over their prisoner with patient, eternal vigilance. Years passed. Daniel returned north and tried to forget, but he couldn't. The images haunted him, his uncle's hollow eyes, Delphine's terrible certainty, the army of the dead bearing witness to generations of cruelty. He became involved in abolition work, speaking at rallies, writing pamphlets, using his family's money to support the cause. He told himself it was enough, that he was making amends for the sins of his family. But at night, he dreamed of the plantation, dreamed of Delphine and her congregation of the dead, and he knew, with a certainty that chilled him, that one day he'd have to answer for his own part in the legacy of slavery, however small. The Civil War came and went. Slavery ended, at least in name. Daniel fought for the Union, survived, and returned to find his father's fortune mostly intact. He married, had children, built a respectable life, but he never went back to Mississippi, never tried to contact Thomas. He told himself his uncle was probably dead by now, that the plantation had likely been abandoned or burned during the war. He was wrong. On Daniel's 50th birthday, a letter arrived. It was written in a shaky hand he didn't recognize, but the signature was unmistakable. Thomas Whitmore. The letter was brief. "Daniel, I'm still here, still alive, though I wish I wasn't. She keeps me alive, I think. Keeps me breathing so I can suffer longer. The war changed nothing. The dead don't care about politics or presidents or proclamations. They care about what was done to them, and they'll never forget. I'm writing this to warn you. You carry the name Whitmore. You carry the blood. And when you die, whenever that is, you'll come here too. You'll join us." That's what she told me. "That's the legacy we've left. There's no escape, no redemption. Only this endless remembering, this eternal punishment. Don't come looking for me. Don't try to save me. Just know that I'll see you again. We all will." Thomas Daniel burned the letter, but he couldn't burn away the fear it had planted in his heart. He lived another 20 years, watching his children grow, building a legacy he hoped would be different from the one he'd inherited. He donated to schools for freed slaves, supported Reconstruction efforts, spoke out against the rising tide of Jim Crow laws. But he knew it wasn't enough, could never be enough. When Daniel died in 1891, his body was buried in Boston with full honors. His obituary praised his service to the Union, his business acumen, his charitable works. His soul woke up in Mississippi. He stood in the overgrown yard of the Whitmore plantation, the house looming before him in the moonlight. It looked exactly as it had 40 years earlier, decaying, haunted, wrong. Thomas was there, waiting. He'd aged not a day since Daniel last saw him, frozen in that state of elderly decay, doomed to exist forever on the edge of death without ever crossing over. "I tried to warn you," Thomas said sadly. Delphine emerged from the house, still beautiful, still terrible, still carrying those wounds that would never heal. "Daniel Whitmore," she said. "Welcome home." "No," Daniel breathed. "No, I fought against slavery. I tried to make amends. You benefited from our suffering," Delphine said. "You built your life on our graves. That doesn't change just because you felt guilty about it." The dead gathered around him, all of them, the ones he'd seen before and countless more. Slaves from other plantations, people who died in chains from Virginia to Texas. They looked at him with eyes that held neither hate nor forgiveness, only a patient certainty. "Is this how it ends?" Daniel asked. "Is this all there is?" "This is how it ends for you," Delphine said. "But for us, we go on. Generation after generation. We welcome the Whitmores home. We show them what they built, what they benefited from, what they can never escape." She gestured to the house. And Daniel saw them other Whitmores, scattered through the rooms, men and women from different eras, all trapped here, all paying the price for sins both committed and inherited. "The dead have long memories," Delphine said, "and we have all the time in the world." As Daniel was led toward the house, toward his new eternal prison, he understood finally what he'd been too afraid to accept in life: that some debts can never be paid, some sins can never be washed clean, and some legacies can never be escaped. The Whitmore plantation stands still, somewhere in Mississippi. Locals avoid it, telling stories of lights in the windows and voices on the wind. Sometimes historians come looking for it, drawn by records of the family that once lived there, but they can never quite find it. The roads twist away, the landmarks shift, and they end up somewhere else entirely, but it's there, waiting, because the dead remember, and the dead collect their debts. And somewhere in that house, on the red clay hill, Delphine keeps watch over her domain, making sure that no one forgets, making sure that everyone pays, making sure that justice, however cruel, however delayed, is finally served. The slave's graveyard behind the house remains unmarked, but at night, if you listen closely, you can hear singing. The old songs, the spirituals, the hymns of suffering and hope. Wade in the water, children. God's gonna trouble the water. And in that troubled water, in that red, clay earth, the dead keep their vigil. Forever, the dead remember. The dead collect their debts. And in Mississippi, on a plantation lost to time, they're still waiting. If this story sent chills down your spine, smash that subscribe button and let us know in the comments where you're watching from. Did this tale of supernatural revenge leave you terrified? What would you do if you were haunted by the sins of your ancestors? Drop your thoughts below, and we'll see you in the next nightmare. Until then, sleep well, if you can.